Hello and welcome to today's Movers and Shakers virtual event. I hope you're all having a great week. My name is Lee Natasha Salter and I'm Managing Director of Movers and Shakers. So today's webinar is on the topic of Beyond MMC. When does modern method of construction become simply construction? So we're delighted that today's event is in association with the London Collective and our good friend Max Farrell. Thank you to him. And is sponsored by BD Solutions. Now, I'm sure most of you know BD. They are a specialist construction consultancy, and they today rebrand, and they're going to be called Better Delivery, simply Better Delivery. And they've got a fantastic, fun, colourful logo. They're going to be updating their website very soon, and they're launching a report called Beyond MMC. And we're going to send you all a copy of that after this event. So thank you to them. Thank you to Jamie and the team for sponsoring. So today you're once again watching our event from our virtual community platform, or indeed our app. I hope you're enjoying it. We launched this at the beginning of the year, at the end of January. We've got great feedback. We've got over 300 members on the community now. The idea behind it was to bring back networking to our virtual events, so you can network 24/7 with our members, to bring together the private and public sectors as well for collaboration. So do use the platform, do give us, as I said, your feedback. There's 50 plus hours of virtual events for you to watch back. We've got our knowledge hubs, and when we go back to physical events, which we're planning for September, you'll be able to network before the event, follow up, watch the event back, and some of our events will be live streamed. So much to look forward to. Back to today's event. So today we welcome a brilliant panel. First of all, we're going to start with a keynote address from Tom Bloxham, MBE, who is Group Chairman of Urban Splash. Now, I know you'll all know Tom, and I was thinking of some words to actually describe Tom, and I came up with original thinker, man with 1,000 hats, creative thinker, and maybe a national treasure. So I think all of those apply to Tom, and we're delighted that you can set off our event today. And Tom will be joined on the panel by Deborah Vogwell, who is the Head of Development Transformation for Homes England. We have Edward Joseph, who is the Senior Investment Manager for Homes England, Tara Bolade, who is the co-founder of the Bolade Design Studio, and finally Matt Warren, who is Head of Digital Engineering Integrated Solutions in Europe for Lendlease, and our Chair, Jamie Parr, who is Director and Founder of BD Solutions, now of course Better Delivery. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. So the topic is Beyond MMC. The terminology, modern methods of constructions, been in widespread use since the sort of 1990s. So the question is it still modern? Many of the so-called modern methods of construction do have more in common with traditional methods than they do with each other. So the idea is, should we put all methods of construction into one box, and should we simply be looking at an optimum method for delivery and construction based on something like the wider benefits to society, looking at sustainability goals, energy and waste, social impact, job creation. So looking at MMC going forward, we're going to have an interesting topic on an interesting discussion, I know, with all our panel on this topic this morning. So I'm going to let them say more and explore these ideas. Don't forget, you can ask questions on our platform, so please do. And Jamie will be taking questions through the discussion. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Jamie, who will then forward to Tom. So welcome, Jamie. Thank you all, and have a really good day. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lee. That's you've covered off a lot of my introduction on that one, but I suppose really just wanted to sort of quickly introduce myself on top of that. So obviously you may or may not know us as BD Solutions. We've gone through a rebrand, and we're now Better Delivery, which is the essence of what everything that we do. We basically span the design, manufacturing, construction, and technology sectors, and we, as Lee's mentioned, in collaboration with the London Collective, have organised this event to essentially try and shift the dial around the conversation around MMC, and try and move away from the narrow focus that has become, MMC essentially meaning off-site construction, so talking about modules and panels, and introduce the concept of beyond MMC. Which is essentially looking beyond at sort of wider impacts on the industry in order to get there, instead of focusing on MMC being the answer to the question. So as mentioned, we'll introduce the panel more formally, but I think that's a really good opportunity for us to pass on to Tom for his keynote presentation. Cheers.
So welcome everybody, my name's Tom Bloxham, and it's great to be here. And I work with a company called Urban Splash, and I suppose really the thesis for me today is not particularly about any methodology of construction. It's about making great places and great homes for people to live in. And I'm going to do a quick presentation which is going to really show the history of Urban Splash, argue that actually MMC isn't particularly new, but it is another tool in our equipment of making great homes and great places. So I am going to try to share my screen now and actually just start with a presentation. So hopefully that is working. So when does modern methods of construction become simply construction? Is it now? Is it in 10 years? Is it 20 years? Or maybe it was actually none of those, but maybe it was as early as 1853. The slide here shows a modular buildings built in Bristol and shipped to Australia. So in some ways, there's nothing new about modular construction. It's another weapon in our armory to produce great places. And for me, it's much more about the quality of the homes we're producing and the way they're produced. So this is a quick 2-minute film called Live Well by Design, which is where Urban Splash is up to at the moment. And then I'm going to tell you a bit about the history and how we've used different construction methods to get here. So for us, MMC or modern methods is a means to an end and not an end in itself. For us, the end is to make really beautiful homes and in great neighborhoods and placemaking. And so Urban Splash has a long history since about 1993. To give you an idea of the scale of the business, we produced over 4,000 homes and a couple of million square feet of commercial space as well, some modular, some conventionally. But what ties it together is a love of architecture, a DNA about great design and great placemaking. And we're working throughout England. To give you an idea of the scale, around 260 colleagues and very vertically integrated. So we do everything from find the land, to do the building, to have our own factory, to build, to develop, to sell and to rent. A bit about myself. So, I mean, I was born in 1963. And I suppose growing up as a young boy, I saw Neil Armstrong land on the moon. I saw Concorde fly. I saw hovercraft being discovered. I saw this huge enthusiasm with technology and change the world. And I got very much into punk music as a kid. And I loved that disruptive element to the punk music. The Sex Pistols came on stage on top of the Pops and changed the world. And all the time, I sort of wanted to follow that through and be a disruptor and change things. And so when I came to college, I started by selling records and then posters, but always the coolest posters. And I like to think now we're making the coolest houses rather than the boring ones. In 1993, we realized, started Urban Splash and realizing there was this host of unoccupied buildings in Manchester and Liverpool where we work in. And we converted those very cheaply into new apartments and brought the first people back to live in Manchester and Liverpool city centres. And, we saw the space outside the buildings. As this two-story building was as important as the space inside the building. And so just by demolishing the building, we created a new town square called Concert Square. And then using good architecture and very conventional build and literally, hiring joiners and builders directly, converting interesting old buildings, bringing people back to live in the city centre, often working in partnership with the public sector, Liverpool City Council in this time, using their assets and our expertise and creating new houses and wealth. Working with some small architects and big architects. This is Brudenberg in Trafford with Norman Foster and partners. And here it's a multi-tenure, some homes for sale, some for rent, some affordable housing, but same spec, same front doors. And some tough neighborhoods like Bradford. This is Lister Mills in Manningham, put these pods on the roof, and very affordable homes for rent and for sale. For Dunlop, commercial buildings as well as residential, and repurposing old tower blocks that were perceived to have no value and no demand, and showing they actually were still in demand if the right bit of marketing and conversions were done with them. 350 terraced housing in Chimney Pot Park in Langworthy, reinventing the idea of the back-to-back Victorian terrace. Park Hill in Sheffield, a different typology, a different mythology, an amazing building, 1,000 homes going from 4 stories to 16 stories, right on the edge of Sheffield city centre, but unloved by Sheffield City Council who owned it. They actually wanted to demolish it, but it got listed, so they couldn't. And some people saw this as a concrete slum, but we saw it as a building of loads of potential. So we're bringing it back into life, working with our partners here, Places with People, finished the first phase, got that fully let, some great apartments, rehouse all the existing residents on social housing terms and new residents. Lakeshore in Bristol, Royal William Yard, so different typologies and different mythologies of building. And as a company, we're vertically integrated, doing our own construction, our residential investment management, commercial, and modular house building as well. We also have our own PRS residential fund, and that means we can rent buildings as well as sell buildings, and a big commercial portfolio of over 1 million square feet. But having been building all these different buildings and basically been building them like the Romans did with bricks and wet cement, around the mid-2000s, we started experimenting with modern methods of construction. The first building we did was a steel frame building called Moho, or modular house. And then more recently, we were thinking about building houses rather than flats, and thinking if we had a blank piece of paper and if we could become the designer, equivalent of design label in housing, what would we do? We also noticed from the research that Reeb and others were doing, that 70% of the population, when they're looking to buy a new house, don't even consider buying new build, they buy second-hand or historic homes. And that seemed very strange to us. Most people, for instance, if they're buying a car, if they can afford to, they buy a new car rather than a second-hand one. So why weren't people buying new homes? And for us, a lot that was on offer. Perhaps this slide is slightly unfair, but it's not the sort of place that inspires me or my friends to want to live. It's about massing as many homes you can per acre, tiny windows, cramming in the number of rooms per home, very cellular. You can't knock the walls down because the ceiling falls in. Could we do something different? Could we do something better? And then we looked at other things like the computers you're watching this on, your phones, your televisions, how they've changed over the last 100 years. And industrializations helped that happen. Factory productions helped that happen. Modern methods of constructions helped that happen. So I bet you when you bought your last television, it was half the price of the previous one, and bigger and better. And yet our new build homes are still getting more and more expensive, arguably no better and often smaller. And is industrialization a way to change that? So we've been experimenting with a blank piece of paper, saying if we design a home but use modern methods of construction, what would we do? And we started with a blank piece of paper, but ended up with a house that looks actually quite like a traditional Victorian house and behaves like one. And we wanted to do something fresh and new and give customers real choice. And we thought particularly that real choice we can only do by MMC. So 2 big moves for us. One was 3 years ago, we bought the factory and the modular business from SIG PLC. And then 2 years ago, we set up a new partnership, taking on investment from Sekisui House and Homes England. So Sekisui House took a 35% stake. I never heard of them, but Japan's biggest house builder. And Homes England took a 5% stake. And clearly they're part of UK government and thought they'd give us a real stamp of credibility and help us with our relationships, particularly with the public sector. Sekisui House, an amazing company, started in 1960, have built 2.5 million homes since then, many of them in the factory, have invested billions overseas in the USA and Australia and Singapore and China, and now in England through their partnership with Urban Splash and House by Urban Splash. Very sustainable and similar values. We talk about live well by design, they talk about making home the happiest place in the world. They have 5 million square feet factories, they employ 1,000 people in the R&D department, they employ 3,000 architects in-house, so plenty we can learn from them. But working with them, core themes about being superhuman, homes fit for people. We're not building units, we're building houses, we're building homes, high ceilings, big windows, design-led, working with the best designers in the world, giving customers real choice. Personalization is a growing trend. We want to do it in housing as well as cars. Being green, being sustainable, so the customer doesn't have to think about it, and being modern, looking forward, not backward. And so if you're buying one for yourself to buy for sale, we give people real choice. And you can only do that through MMC. Do you want the kitchen on the top floor, the bottom floor? Do you want an open plan? Do you want it cellular? And nowadays you can do all this on our app. Feel free to go on the website, House by Urban Splash, and configure one. And then how do we build it? You pay your money, pays your choice, but how do we build it? Not with hairy arse builders, not battling the elements of the snow and the rain and the ice, not relying on itinerant labor with brickies moving from scheme to scheme. In most industries, itinerant labor went out of the Middle Ages, but we build them like we build our cars in a factory. We own our own factory. For the last 3 years, been slowly improving. We can build a house now in 14 days on the production line. At the end of those 14 days, it's complete and it comes on the back of a lorry, quite literally. We can assemble 2 or 3 houses in a single day. And then these are our completed homes, very different from most new build homes. High ceilings, big windows, flexible space, a bit like an old Victorian house really, where you can, all the structures in the outside walls, so you can do what you want inside. Flexible on the cladding options, so they can fit in with any vernacular. We've done the difficult part of getting the BOPAS, getting the mortgage approvals, and now we're working throughout the country. But like I say, the most important thing for us is not actually the house themselves, but the space around the house, the placemaking. I'm going to take you through a couple of our schemes now quickly. First one is in Manchester, again, joint venture with Homes Community Agency, now Homes England, Manchester City Council, and Great Places. This was a very tough council estate, the old Cardroom estate. If any of you have seen Shameless on the television, it's actually where they filmed that, but a canal next to it. So we start working with Allsops architects, making a master plan, building a new canal, making a model, making pictures, making a painting to show people our vision, our aspiration. Then we start executing, delivering on our vision, putting a new park in Cottonfield Park, a new marina, 44 houseboats, rehousing all the existing residents, letting them design their own homes, working with interesting architects like FAT, de Metz and May, sponsoring a new free school, working with Manchester Grammar School, one of the best independent schools, Ofsted outstanding, great education, a new GP surgery, building a steel frame building, chips building, homes for rent and for sale, restoring the traditional old mill building stubs, creating hundreds of jobs, occupied Fanatics internet sportswear firm, so making mixed use communities, as well as our new modular townhouses alongside the canal. And the advantage is we can build these very quickly. This was a site owned by Manchester City Council. Within a year, we agreed to acquire the site. We put in all the investment. We got planning. We got the site built all within a year. Some affordable housing, some for sale housing, regeneration coming in there, capital receipts for the council. And then there's a different typology called Mansion House. This is a panelized system made of CLT or cross-laminated timber, incredible material, wood-based like giant plywood. And these 6 guys built the whole building wind and watertight in 12 weeks. Exposed structure, just completed this one, fully sold out, really popular, some for rent, some for sale, double aspect apartments, multi-core, but every flat's got a view over the marina, every flat is double aspect. Great views. And very much about making mixed-use spaces. So as well as affordable housing, residential houseboats, the best bakery, Pollen in Manchester, car scales, We set up a festival, shared ownership, social event, a nursery, a school. Another scheme, Smith Dock up in the northeast, disused dockyard, closed down, lost a lot of jobs, came up. Again, we made a master plan. We executed that master plan with our modular houses, this time in a crescent. We worked with George Clark, who's a small shareholder in the business, with a special edition Fab House. Built with Simpson Huff smokehouses, put in restaurants, put in bars, changed the nature of the space, really changing, pushing the values. Port Loop in Birmingham, 1,200 homes in Birmingham City Centre, an amazing site working here at Birmingham City Council and Canals Rivers Trust, an island site with a canal running all the way around it. The first thing we did was put in a new public park, made a manifesto, talk about green streets, not mean streets, building our modular houses, but alongside our modular houses, also building conventional brick houses, put a new park in, some private space, some shared space, some public parks. Up in Wirral in Merseyside, working with Peel on a joint venture, Wirral Waters, this is on site at the moment. Northstowe in Cambridgeshire, joint venture with Homes England. That's our sales suite, homes for sale. Grappenhall Woods in Warrington, very much here, more suburban site. Milton Keynes, 800 homes. Windermere working in partnership with the National Trust. So a variety of different areas working in partnership, very, very sustainable homes, embodied carbon. We're lucky enough to win a number of awards. We like working in partnership, in joint venture, particularly with the public sector. If you want to find out more, look at our websites, follow us on social media. And the last slide, but perhaps the most important, that actually how you build homes is less important than what you're building. We're building homes, not units. And we're very privileged, and this was an oath sworn by the citizens of ancient Athens, that we shall leave this city not less, but greater, better, more beautiful is left to us. And really, that's what Urban Splash and all of us who are involved in building environment should aspire to, in my view, of leaving our towns and cities slightly better than we found them. So thank you very much for listening to me. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. That was fantastic. I suppose just a few takeaways from that to kind of frame the panel discussion before everybody, bring everybody in. But, one of the things that we've tried to convey from this event and the whole concept around Beyond MMC is that whether intentionally or otherwise, the focus around MMC seems to have become around just how you build and the physical, the project. But if you look at that as part of the wider process, it is only a small element of it. Now, you will have noticed in Tom's presentation, the things that really matter are, the placemaking, how that solution may, deals with sustainability issues. How do you use digital to wrap that? So the panel has been put together to kind of give some shape around some of the wider issues outside of MMC. Lee mentioned in the introduction, we're launching our sort of rebrand. The event's not about me. I'm chairing today, so I'll have to keep quiet, which is unusual for me. But we have actually launched a document explaining what we mean by Beyond MMC. So if anybody's interested in that, that's on our link at betterdelivery.co.uk. But fundamentally, it's a concept which looks at the wider issues, and we've kind of tried to distill them down into 9 wider topics, which include sustainability, technology, not just, but essentially things outside of cost, so carbon, social value, and the impact on design, etc. Some of the points that Tom's raised. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel and just get everybody just give a bit of an intro, and then we'll get dived into some of the questions from ourselves and the audience. So I'm going to start kick things off with Deborah Vogwell from Homes England.
Okay. Hello everybody. It's a really tough thing to have to follow Tom's amazingly inspirational presentation just now. That was fantastic. But in terms of introducing me, I'm an architect and project manager by background, and over my career I've worked on a wide range of commercial and cultural projects and sort of university projects before I joined Homes England. And in recent years I've worked on the long-term procurement solutions that Homes England uses, and those are also shared by our partners. Now, I will confess that this is a role that I sort of fell into. I didn't sort of see that was a role that I would take, when I started my architectural training. But once I started working sort of in procurement and working with the public and private sector partners, I became really interested in developing processes that enable the public and private sector to work together as effectively as possible. There's a real need to bridge the gap and build understanding that the issues that the other side is facing, and procurement is often that bridge, for better or worse. So we're all here to talk about MMC and improving delivery. And in order to do that, I think there really needs to be an understanding of the way that the traditional sort of residential development model works and how it's different from more mainstream construction. For like a museum or office development, that's very much designed as one thing, constructed as one thing, and the focus of the whole team is just on doing that one thing in the best way possible. But housing's really different, and we live in a country where there's a real aspiration still for owner occupation. And although homes might be part of a bigger development, they're still really sold one by one. So on any scheme, the master planning is done first, we get planning permission, but once that's in place, the appointed house builder doesn't always just get on and build out as speedily as possible. The scheme is often built out so that 3 or 4 homes are finished off each month. Now, in my naivety, I thought for many years that this was really all that was possible, but obviously that's not the case. Building 3 or 4 a month is often the best way to ensure that no stock is left unsold. And that's obviously the rate at which the market can absorb the homes. Prices can be maintained and cash flow is smoothed and manageable. So this is the business model that many developers still use. And traditional methods of brick and block construction work really well if the aim is to build a few, sell a few. And it's brilliant to see that there are other house builders and developers challenging this and doing things differently. But I think for mainstream house building, this business model is the key barrier, and we need to really understand the ways to address that. So that's my opening pitch. I hope that's okay, Jamie.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Well, we're going to come back to some of the sort of the broader questions and go into that in a bit more detail. So next to introduce is Edward Joseph, who's also Homes England, but coming at this from an investments angle, which is one of the critical factors in all of this, unlocking the kind of the puzzle that is MMC. So over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Jamie. So hi, I'm Edward Joseph. I'm working in the investment director at Homes England, as Jamie says. For those who don't know, Homes England is kind of government's housing agency. We're here to unlock housing delivery in England, to support the sector, to deliver the government's ambitions of around 300,000 homes per year. In the investment directorate, I work with the kind of financial resources the agency has, development and infrastructure finance, and affordable housing and infrastructure grants. Whereas Deborah, who you've heard earlier, is on the land and development side, disposing of that public sector land. So my role looks across our financial resources, equity investment, lending alliances with banks, and using government guarantees. I also work closely on the construction productivity and transformation agenda, which includes our support for MMC delivery. So part of that role is really acting as an interface between kind of government policy objectives, that big picture around construction productivity, where we know construction is one of the least productive parts and digitized parts of the UK economy, and that productivity is key to rising living wages, living standards, and competitiveness of the economy. Alongside kind of housing policy priorities around delivery capacity, home quality, safety, sustainability. And then this support for MMC is then embedded in Homes England's programmes, which looks at how we use our land and financial resources to support the sector adopt MMC solutions. And then I work closely with colleagues on the ground who are kind of helping the market deliver via MMC homes, whether that's through the affordable housing grants or development finance. So that's me.
Thanks very much. So next to introduce is Tara Baladi from Baladi Design, and I'll let her introduce herself and what she does in the business world.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm Tara Valade. I'm director of Valade Design Studio. We're a practice based in London, specializing in sustainability-led developments in the residential sector, and also working with local authorities on a strategic level with their sustainability goals and ambitions. I'm also involved with DRPs across London. I'm part of the Architects Declare steering group. I'm specifically interested in this conversation because of the question of beyond MMC. Is an important one. It asks us to rethink not just about systems and processes, but critically about the what behind the why. For me, this lies squarely on the quality of places, as Tom highlighted earlier, and the performance of our buildings, so homes, workplaces. In the face of one of the biggest challenges globally, the climate and biodiversity emergency, and following on from the warning we received in 2018 from some of our top scientists in the IPCC about the danger and catastrophe if we don't act now. My interest therefore lies in the context of reaching overall our net zero carbon targets, whether the targets set by governments, for carbon neutrality by 2050, or the more recently revised down version, cutting emissions by 78% by 2035, or indeed the even more ambitious local authorities who are aiming for achieving carbon neutrality targets by 2030. Certainly in the lead up to COP26, it's important that our industry collectively makes strides towards meeting these targets using varying methods of construction, keeping in mind exactly how we can address net zero carbon and net zero waste solutions now. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And last but not least, we're going to introduce Matt Warren from Lend-Lease. I think most people know Lend-Lease, but I'll let Matt expand on that.
Okay, cheers, Jamie. Morning, everybody. Hope everyone's well. So I'm Matt Warren. I head up digital engineering within our Europe region, which I'll explain in a minute. But similar to other members of the panel, I came through an architecture background. Didn't quite make it all the way through to fully qualified because I jumped ship after part 2. But I did work in practice from the age of 16, so I saw it from a long way and heavily involved in design and delivery for 15 years before I took a jump into Lend-Lease, into the dark side, as some people say, for construction and development. But I very much find it in the lightning side, and that's where I've been for the last 6 years, looking after a varied kind of sections of the business. So from design management down in Elephant Park and Elephant Castle, through to new business operations, looking after external client world, into my current role, which is digital engineering. Now, for those of you who don't know Lend-Lease, I'll just, which most of you probably will, bit of an overview. So we're a global business, about 11,000 people in total now globally. But we don't just operate in one area. We operate in development on our own portfolio of work, which is both commercial and residential. We also operate in construction, and we have an investment and an asset management arm as well. So if you take our construction arm, 50% of that pretty much residential, and our development portfolio that we do for ourselves. And the other 50% is for external clients. So whether that's Google, new HQ in London, or Manchester Town Hall in terms of a refurb, it's quite a diverse portfolio. But it means that we get a really good coverage of both government, private, public sector, residential, commercial offices. It's fantastic expertise to get across the piece. Now, in terms of my role, which is head of digital engineering for integrated solutions for Lend-Lease in Europe, it's a bit of a mouthful. The reason it's integrated solutions is we've taken some of the people who know our stuff and know how we do our jobs, all the expertise in the business, and we've centralized them to support both our construction and our development world. My role is to basically support my team to enable and empower our people to use those digital tools to unlock, for example, MMC, particularly around that DFMA approach, but really get some decent operational procedures in place and start skilling people so that we can do the best we can with the digital skills, and get us to make better informed decisions on projects. And yeah, really looking forward to it. And just found out I'm in Birmingham today, and I passed Portloop, and it's been a year since I passed in on the train. I didn't enjoy the train journey, but Portloop looked fantastic, really did.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I suppose everybody's been introduced. Tom's on the panel as well, but he's obviously had his fantastic presentation. So I suppose there's quite a few avenues, and this is part of the issue around the debate that we always get stuck into, which is the MMC as a concept. But I suppose one of the things for us that I want to sort of start the conversation on is around how long do we call MMC? Tom touched on it in his presentation. It's something that really is a point of kind of interest for us, that do we still call MMC in 15 years, and is that really a success? And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to sort of start with and start with Tom's thoughts on is how important the link up with Sekisui is in terms of just bringing in that expertise, but also kind of, in simple terms, normalizing MMC. You know, in Japan and places like Sweden, MMC is just construction, and it's an option on a list of materials. So could you give some insight on that, Tom, for us?
I mean, it's worth saying for us that probably the houses we built to date have all been at least as expensive and arguably slightly more expensive than building them conventionally. So we could have built everything conventionally and probably saved a bit of money. The reason we're doing MMC is we believe the way to actually, in the long term, to increase productivity is through industrialized processes. If you look at a graph, that the productivity on construction has not changed in the last 30 years. The productivity on manufacturing has improved by 70% in the last 30 years in rough terms. So, you know, we have got a big issue in the UK of not building enough houses and the houses being too expensive. So we're very passionate about adding to the existing product capacity and making our homes as affordable as possible to as many people as possible. And as you say, in Japan, this is very normal. In Japan, they have 5 million square feet factories. So, you know, I think we are now outliers and this will become the norm. But I'd also add, you know, 30 years ago when urban splash started, city centre living in northern cities was outliers. Nobody, you know, 200 people lived in the city centre. Urban living was outline, it's now the norm. When we came up with the name urban splash, urban was a very negative word. It was urban blight, urban deprivation, urban task force. Today, many companies are taking on urban as a positive thing. So things do change. And, you know, we want to be the forefront of those changes. So, you know, we are seeing, it's not just urban splash clearly, but companies like LNG, like Ilke, big investment banks, SoftBank, you know, the biggest merchant banks are all investing in companies involved with MMC. So I believe it's the future. I believe it'll change. I believe if you have this seminar in 20 or 30 years, many more companies will use many more industrialized processes.
Brilliant, thank you. So I suppose on that thread, interesting to add to the debate, Deborah's obviously Homes England and focused on frameworks manager on the frameworks as she mentioned, but actually she's a trained architect as well. So I'm interested to kind of get, you know, expand on your comments about, you know, standardization, you know, what actually residential can learn from other sectors where, you know, a kind of DFMA or MMC approach is almost more normalized already.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, I'm on. Yeah, it was one of the things that really surprised me actually when I moved to working for Homes England, because I really came to residential development sort of relatively late in my career. And I was sort of thinking back to, if you work on an office building, for example, a lot of the components of that building, whether it's curtain walling, raised floors, you know, demountable partitions, whatever it is, a lot of those elements are elements which are produced in a factory, and they are assembled in clever ways by architects and designers. So the building is put together, you know, through a lot of components which are produced, you know, in factories. So within house building, a similar sort of thing doesn't seem to occur. So with a lot of the mainstream house builders, you know, we sort of tend to see that it becomes a little bit binary. It's either a case of building with, you know, bricks and pieces of wood and tiles, which we've been doing since Roman times, or at the other end of the scale, it's looking to produce, you know, sort of homes which are, you know, a single home is built entirely in a factory as a single unit. We were sort of wondering if there was some middle ground really, where, you know, you could use architects a lot more, because of course architects are not used by a lot of the big house builders a great deal. You could use architects an awful lot more to actually design through a range of components. And we discussed this with our developers at an event we had, you know, an event we held last year. And one of the concerns they had was if they used particular systems, and they've designed for one particular system and that company goes bust, then they can't substitute another system. And I started to think about this, it's quite strange. And, you know, obviously with, you know, with an office building, if you have a demountable partition system, you can't use one, you can substitute for another. It's relatively easy, they're fairly interchangeable. The only thing we could think of in house building that was interchangeable was kitchen units in the, you know, the standard mainstream house building. So if one supplier goes bust, you can use another. So I think really what I'd really like to see is, rather than individual homes being entirely made in a factory, is much more use of architects to assemble components to build homes. And I think that's sort of a way forward, which mirrors a lot of what happens in other areas of construction. So I hope that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. And I think that's something that, I think that's something that kind of is stirring around at the moment, is what's the optimum way to go. And one of the kind of things I've written on my pad to come back to is and both yourself and Tom have alluded to this, it is actually a focus on shifting the models, the business models that developers and investors are actually deploying in order to deliver. Obviously, Tom's a vertically integrated model. Some of the companies that were mentioned as well are going down that path, and that gives control over the design and the whole process. So on the subject of process, I suppose that'd be a good opportunity for sort of Edward to bring in kind of more of a view on what's happening in the kind of the wider investment world, and then some of the external factors that are actually driving your conversations. So if you can give us your insight on that, Edward.
Yeah, of course. So if it's okay, I'm just going to come in on the Japanese point, because I think it's a really interesting one first. If it's okay. So Japan was obviously the market leader in terms of sophistication, technology, and scale. They're easily 20 years ahead of where we are at the moment, and we're working hard to kind of catch up with them. But only about 15% of Japanese housing is delivered in this way. So they haven't actually cracked it at a national scale, even though they are the market leader, which is, I think, an important takeaway. In terms of the drivers for MMC, I've obviously talked about the government policy objectives around productivity, but also there's a real convergence of other issues. You've got labour skill shortages, you've got quality, you've got safety, sustainability. You're beginning to see how all of these agendas could be achieved in that manufacturing and controlled environment. From an industry perspective, where the sector is really taking advantage of this speed is where time value of money is important to investors. So build to rent and affordable houses, where effectively in IRR terms, you get a higher return by delivering those homes faster. Whereas Deborah was obviously talking about traditional build for sale, where effectively it's more cost of capital driven, which doesn't convey that incentive in a build out rate in a scenario. But also, actually, interestingly, sustainability and ESG is also being another motivator that I'm beginning to see come through, where effectively you can see that the homes built in a factory environment are more sustainable, there is less wastage, they're more energy efficient. And actually, if you're a build to rent operator, that flows to value in terms of reduced energy bills and energy efficiency. So it's in there's commerciality alongside that ESG agenda. And also then kind of community acceptance of construction. So because it's a faster construction period and because it's less noisy and it's less dirty, you're bringing in, modules in Tom's example, very fast, few lorry movements and cranes, and you're gone in half the time. That's a lot more acceptable for a community as opposed to several years of as Tom put, hairy-ass builders on site.
No, that's brilliant. So you've unintentionally teed up a really interesting kind of point for Tara to sort of feed into, because one of the areas of the sort of, if you like, the items that are beyond MMC that is probably top of the list, arguably, is the carbon and sustainability agenda, and how we can utilize design and non-systemized approaches to resolve that. With the outcome may be that MMC as we know it, or essentially offsite construction, is the answer, but it's not the focus. I think that at least from our kind of perspective in the sort of consultancy world, I think that there's a tendency to kind of deal with sustainability and carbon in isolation because it's such a big topic, whereas we kind of try and advocate dealing with that as a sum of its parts. And actually the likelihood is it will lead you to MMC, but the kind of the current vernacular and the noise in the industry is to start with MMC as the answer to the question. And we sort of always say, well, what's the question? What are you asking? And I think that's quite important. So Tara, if you wanted to kind of throw in your thoughts on that, I think it'd be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly how we try to approach a question like, you know, when a client comes across and says, you know, we'd like this scheme delivered in MMC. The first thing we do, I guess, is lay out our process, and that's adopting a holistic approach to sustainability. So looking at environmental sustainability and energy, landscape-led design, sustainable travel, but through to socioeconomic. So thinking from the beginning about placemaking, health and well-being, designing for different demographics, and the nuances that needs to be considered in these. And we bring this to sort of large scale and small scale projects alike. It's the same process because it matters to both. And it means that when we work with clients, we certainly, the first question we ask is try to identify our targets. So what are we aiming to reach? We need those clear goals because they, at the beginning, help us to start making decisions on construction or methodology. And so we're asking questions like, what are we trying to achieve here? Is it carbon neutrality? What is the definition of that to you? Is that UKGBC's definition or Letty's definition, for example? If we're choosing targets, are we looking at the RIBA 2030 targets, or are we looking at something like Passive House? And recognizing that both have nuances that have implications for construction. So these questions, and certainly with one of the projects, for example, we're doing a small scheme in Crystal Palace, where we've decided to look at the RIBA 2030 targets. We're looking at operational and embodied carbon from the beginning. And with the industry having spent the majority of our time looking at operational energy, we're refocusing attention on embodied carbon as we all need to do. So this means that we're making decisions such as, I guess, what is our principal building material? Are we looking at masonry versus timber, for example? That affects the weight of our foundations. If we're choosing timber, are we looking? If we're not choosing timber, for example, are we looking at offsetting? Perhaps does that look like on-site or off-site offsetting? Early decision making means that we're able to think of our strategies when it comes to circular economy outcomes, and perhaps a cradle-to-cradle strategy with the ultimate aim of becoming net zero waste. So questions like, I guess, also including questions such as how are we building in layers? What are the lifespans of particular layers, the structure, the facade, internal fit out, recognizing that those need to be given weight. Could lime mortar be used for the brick skin, for example, meaning there's an element of reusability post future demolition. Critically, I guess this process allows us to lead us down the questions of, is MMC right for this scheme? And if so, could generative design be used and implemented depending on the scale potentially of the scheme? Ultimately, it allows us to conserve our resources and increase efficiency, as was highlighted earlier, through the amount of materials we use, including resources such as sort of directly related, but energy and water as well. Eliminate waste, thinking about longevity of the build and designing for disassembly, but also finally managing waste as was highlighted earlier through construction, demolition, and excavation.
Great, thank you. I was frantically scribbling away there because there's a lot of points that kind of we can definitely come back to in the further discussion. And I suppose as well, there's also again, intentional or otherwise, it's a really good segue for sort of what Matt's involved in the digital world, which, you know, we could argue that every one of these points that we're speaking about should be the central point of focus, but actually the digital solutions and technology, at least in our perspective, is the wrapper to all of this. You know, it will enable you to, you know, record and monitor, you know, progress, things like, you know, your embodied carbon calculations, for example, you know, product performance, etc. So, Matt, I suppose really there's quite a lot of avenues we can go down, but if you can give us some insights in terms of how you're using digital tools and data at Lendlease, I think that would be a good starting point.
Yeah, there is a lot of avenues, and I suppose without trying to not avoid the question, or maybe a bit more specific for people. So with every business, everyone will want to use data. We're in this kind of data mad world now, where the word data itself is probably one of the most used words on a daily basis. And it's about we're in a world where I don't think we're that dissimilar to many practices and many businesses, where actually collation of data is important, and then we're going to move into a phase of understanding, well, what's it telling us and why is it important? The bit that's really important for me, and being really selfish about it, and if I come back to the term of is MMC here or where will it be in 10 years, I don't suppose I talk about the word MMC or people around me or what we do. We talk about MMC that regularly, mainly because it's got to be that mindset of, well, here's what we do. Whether that MMC means something physical on site or means something that we enable beforehand, it's kind of not the point. It's more about, for us, as from a digital perspective, well, what tools are we giving people to help them? So if I look at Lendlease and go, well, where are we focused now? What's the objective for us? Well, I'll be really selfish. At Lendlease, we're not too different to a lot of businesses, a lot of practices, a lot of approaches. But what we do have is we've got the people who work for us. I mean, that's our main asset. We're a really multi-disc base. We've got some amazing people. We're facades experts, a lot of former architects who are so specialists in, for example, passive house. And we've got all these people in our teams who have front-end design. We've got commercial expertise. We've got people from financial backgrounds who really understand what they know. And when you get delivered a project and you look at it, well, how do they input? How do they get engaged in the job? And that's where my world is, really, to go, well, how do we give people avenues or platforms to work in where they can understand what it is they're looking at and make informed decisions? And the big bit that I'm kind of focused on now, and it's all about enablement. So whether that's enabling MMC or it's enabling the net carbon agenda, whatever that is, it's about taking a step back and being realistic with it and going, okay, when you've got over 1,000 people in a region working on over 20 jobs, likelihood is they'll be working with 10 or 20,000 people collectively all right now. So how are you actually providing something at scale where people can use data? Well, for us, that's about just being really clear and standardizing and making sure that actually what we give them and the tools we give them are actually available. They do work. They're easily accessible. You don't have to have a massive 17-kilogram laptop in your backpack to kind of manage a model or a data set. It's on your phone, it's app, it's connected to you. It allows people to then share ideas and communicate with each other far better. And that's the whole approach for us, because the theory there is if we can get everybody in our business working at a single platform level where they've taken a step up into this digital world, everybody, then those people who have the natural digital engagement enablement, that's neither age or background specific, that is anybody, they'll naturally take those steps. But what I recognize is if you want MMC on a job or you want to really change the way you work, you can't completely change the way you set up a job every single time, because it becomes like an overload for people. So we're very much basic approach at the moment is establishing really good rhythms and just making sure our people can use the data. That's the biggest evidence, that's the biggest focus point. And we see the benefits. So we see the benefits now because we have repetitive success. We have that industrialization, manufacturing approach, but just with how people talk and work together. And that's the focus for us.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. So there's so many things I've written down that I think we really need to touch on. So we're coming into the last 20 minutes. So just a bit of admin. I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but obviously the audience listening, obviously we can't see you guys, but you are able to ask questions. So if anybody's got anything that they want to fire in as well, and I'll try and get that into the conversation. But I suppose the kind of recurring themes that keep coming up and I want to sort of draw on a little bit more is business models and the importance of emerging models that we're seeing around kind of partnerships and vertical integration. One thing that I think affects all of this is whether these decisions need to be made at a strategic level as opposed to a project level. From our experience, we find it very challenging when you're trying to fight fight time. Essentially, a project starts at a certain date and you're trying to get all of these things done by deadlines such as planning or post-planning. And if the client hasn't resolved some of these issues, sustainability being massive, really the fundamental reason why they want to do MMC, as in the business case, is you're kind of fighting a losing battle. So it's that kind of strategy over project. And then one, again, I'd be interested in, we'll go around everybody afterwards, but keep talking about MMC, like how important is terminology? One of the things that I'm very passionate about is that we do need a common language, but is MMC actually the right thing? Because it doesn't, the word itself doesn't allow it to evolve. Going back to my point about, is it still MMC in 15 years? Is that an evolving thing? Just be interested to get everybody's view. I don't profess to know the answers, and I don't think it's a good idea to have yet another analogy or a 3-letter word that we've got to try and remember. So with that in mind, I think, let's start with the kind of the business models element, because Tom and Matt are what you would determine as vertically integrated, but I suppose where we're coming from is trying to enable this for the wider market. So I guess starting with Tom, just you mentioned a bit of it, Tom, in your presentation, but sort of just give us an insight into I guess the reason and rationale behind the vertical integration and the benefits that that gives you as a business, really.
So when we talk about MMC, I think it's quite important to be vertically integrated. And I think the basic premise of that is a factory should be producing one product the whole time and be as efficient as possible as it can with that. So on car factories, for instance, you don't get the same factory producing Minis one week and Land Rovers the next week. You have one factory producing Land Rovers and one producing Minis. And the idea that people come to a factory and say, can you produce this house type they're already building traditionally out of a factory, I think is the wrong way to approach it. And I think we start with a blank piece of paper and saying, actually, these are house types. This is what works well with factory production. Now, that doesn't mean we can't work with partners, and we can work with partners, and typically with RPs, with landowners, with local authorities. And actually, they typically put the land in, sometimes the finance in, and we put the expertise in, the knowledge in the factory production, and work in partnership to build something together. So I think the vertical integration actually works very well with us, and actually thinking not just about the way the house looks, but how that interacts in the landscape. And, you know, rather than master planning now, we are thinking that actually what we're doing is producing a landscape and actually putting our houses inside the landscape rather than the other way around as a landscape architect coming afterwards. So, you know, I think vertical integration works well for us, but it's by no means the only model.
I think we might have lost Deborah for a second there, but I'm sure she'll come back in. But Matt, have you got some sort of additional comments on that in terms of your view on it?
Yeah, I think from an MMC perspective, and supply chain is huge, and planning for that is really important. So I suppose I'd echo Tom saying about the industrialization and standardization of an approach, and go, well, actually, let's try and make this work as efficiently as possible. Those decisions and the efficiency of decision making is the key thing. You can quite often spend 2 years in advance planning their job, going around the houses 3 times over, and then, no pun intended, and then literally come onto a job and make some decisions and try and build it as quick as you can. That pre-aimed kind of planning process, and really get into an understanding of how you do it to the best ability and get everyone involved is a real key. I'd echo what just Tara mentioned, the scenario around CLT. I know Tom's systems review CLT. Yeah, CLT is fantastic. From a design perspective, you know, you've got consultants who will actively want to engage with CLT and want to design with it. But then actually, you've got to be really paired in with those supply chain and trades at the same time to understand what the scale of those panels are, what the positions, the fixing ratios are going to be, what the combined systems are for insurance models. And you've also then got to consider, well, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, how quickly are my logistics on site going to really allow me to establish this on a build site? If it isn't going to be one component, there's going to be a number. How do I construct this? How do I construct this in an environment where it's suitable for UK as well? And those things require consultants, client teams, trades, and operational delivery expertise to all be combined together. And that's the key. And I think that's when we come back to arrangements and organizational conversations and how you contract, that is a massive area. So enablement of MMC needs to be able to make those decisions before you start to fix your budget and go, that's exactly how I'm going to do this job. If you approach it after that event, it's very difficult then to adopt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So on that, I think, because we're conscious we've got this, we could talk about this for hours, I think. So I think I'm going to sort of surmise this just for the purposes of trying to get some other questions in. But that kind of discussion, even around the models scenario, is potentially counterance to some of the other views in the market around having a component-based platform-led supply chain that everybody can adopt. So I think that whilst there's a really good argument for having everything under one roof and the sort of control that brings in terms of process and product, I think that that debate will still be staring away. So you sort of touched on it, and I think it's probably a good one to bring in the sort of strategic over project base and sort of start with a bit of sort of input from Tara on that, because we see this in terms of we're specialist consultancy brought in, we focus on modern methods and digital tools, etc. And we're brought in by clients to kind of, they'll ring us up and say, I want to do MMC on a project, and there's we've got a 120 unit scheme in London. There you go. And our first question is why? And they don't often know, or someone on the board said we need to do MMC. And then going to my point earlier, you're sort of fighting the, against the tide a little bit. So I suppose the question is, how important is the kind of strategic level debate over project level?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think certainly with the work we've done with clients, all different types, but specifically even the work I've personally done with the Garden Town in terms of Harlow & Gilson Garden Town, and looking at a more strategic approach in sustainable developments, ensuring that irrespective of what comes in, with the Garden Town, so for context, 20,000 plus new homes coming over the next 20 plus years. So these are massive developments coming in. So irrespective of what methodology we'll be using or exploring across the developers there, it's important that there's a strong understanding of the why. And for us, that looks at sustainability. So whether that's running across, and it looks at sustainability in a whole host of themes. So I touched on sort of circular economy earlier, and waste reduction and water reduction, but themes including energy efficiency and renewable energy on a much more strategic and master planning scale. It's critical because it allows, I think, setting out that agenda by local authorities, a lot of which are doing so now. Last year, I think we had 70% of local authorities who declared a climate emergency, and now it's much more, having them take the lead in setting these agendas, irrespective of how fast or slow government generally is moving, I think is such a critical aspect, because it allows us to have these more meaningful conversations as opposed to developers and house builders coming in and building what they've always done. I think it's always important that, we all have agency in different capacities. Architects have agency and clients have agency, and it's important for the clients to come in with recognizing their standards. So even though they might have X number of sites, we're working with a housing association at the moment who've got quite a lot of garage sites. And I think the interesting question and discussion we're having with them is rather than looking at this as individual garage sites, what is the strategic approach for this? Even if we're looking at MMC, again, that's just a tool. What is the strategic approach across your 600 sites? And I think it's been far more interesting to have those types of conversations and have them. I've been very impressed, actually, I must say, with local authorities, the public sector, local authorities, housing associations recently, who've really sort of taken this and decided to make a strong stand for themselves.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I think it's probably a good, really good summary that the client groups are actually starting to wake up to the idea of actually dealing with things as a program of works as opposed to independent projects and that kind of mentality that brings. On the subject, I just wanted to expand out to get a bit of a Homes England view, and I'll leave between Edward and Deborah who dives in on this. But you guys are obviously, particularly in the residential world, this conversation wasn't necessarily just about resi, but it's a really core area of that we need to unlock as an industry. So yeah, the strategic kind of moves that you guys are making and to try and drive clients' thinking. So if you can give some insights in perhaps what you're doing in that sphere, it'd be really interesting.
Okay. Do you want to go first, Edward, or shall I?
By all means, and I'll follow on. Okay,
yeah. Okay, so it's quite interesting what we were saying a bit earlier about local authorities and RPs. Because I mean, I've done a lot of work with local authorities over the years in terms of helping them procure developers and helping them through the development process. And we've often found that their approach has been amazingly refreshing, and they've got some very clear goals and objectives. And similarly with a lot of the RPs, I mean, again, they have some amazing goals and objectives to create fantastic places to live. You think of organisations like Places for People, for example, which is one of my favourites. So what it sort of comes back to a little bit for me is very much that with any sort of building project, whether it's a housing project, it's an office, it's a museum, whatever it is, it's having the objectives of that particular project in mind, and the objectives for that project then define the way that you do it and what it is. So if you're a local authority and your goal is to create some houses that you're going to keep, you're going to rent out, you're going to build them, you're going to keep, you're going to own them at the end, you're going to rent them out to local residents, then that's a very different sort of model, because they obviously they have a long-term interest in that particular development, and they can control all of the specification in that development. They can control the way it's built. And if you contrast that with, for example, a site that's, sort of disposed of on a traditional house builder model, for example, say that same local authority sells the site off, and they just want some money for that site, they want some houses built on it, they're not particularly precious about what's built, then obviously that goes into the drivers are very, very different, and the drivers become much more commercial drivers, and that becomes very driven by the house builder. So it's really looking at the drivers for each project and understanding how they are different. I hope that makes sense. I'm sure you can add to that, Edward.
Yeah, I'm going to come from a slightly kind of different perspective in terms of what we're trying to support the sector to achieve. So effectively, we're not here to, as government, to pick winners in terms of technologies or housing formats, modular or panelised. We're very agnostic to the ways of achieving our policy objectives. So it's about us setting the goal around, we want high productivity, quality, safety, sustainability, and we'd like to see more work done in a factory environment controlled, where we know we can achieve those policy objectives, rather than on site where we're in traditional world, where we have the same labour issues that we're all familiar with. So effectively, it's about us setting that ambition and then putting our resources to drive that objective, but allowing the market to find solutions that work for them. So to find a solution that delivers what they want as commercial entities, but also achieves what Homes England is trying to do around those wider policy objectives. So that's how we're reorientating our support for the market. And that means we are focusing more on, say, whole house solutions. So where you're delivering the whole house in that manufactured, industrialized approach, as opposed to just a bathroom or just a kitchen, which is, a good starting point if you're on a journey of engaging with MMC, but it doesn't get us where we're trying to get to on its own.
Right. There's some questions coming in that are linking into this conversation really nicely, so I'm going to throw them out there, probably starting with the Homes England, and then there's quite a few digital questions. I think that's quite a topic at the moment. So we've had a question in regarding everybody's dreaded subject, procurement, and how that's unlocking could be used to unlock MMC. So I'm gonna have to read it because it's reasonably long, but the crux of it is, what are the modern methods of procurement and funding, essentially, is the wider question. So essentially, are there any advances in either of those fields that will help drive improvements in productivity and innovation? For example, collaborative forms of contract, value-led procurement, as opposed to just the more traditional focus on just minimising risk. So it's quite a good question.
Shall I kick off, Deborah, and would you like to come in?
Yeah, absolutely, yes, if you want to, yeah.
So effectively, you've got a very different type of contracting approach. When a manufacturer, you're buying a product. So actually, you're getting a product delivered from a factory at a price. So you've got real cost certainty, and arguably there's significantly diminished risk. But it means that your contracting route means that you're going to have maybe a JCT for your foundations, which is quite traditional, but then actually you've got a manufacturing contract, which has got a completely different payment profile and structure legally to traditional construction. And therefore everybody's beginning to learn this approach, and the standard forms of documents are being updated. And there's a growing industry understanding in both the legal profession and construction about how you mitigate the risk and how you deliver that. But for me, one of the key things is that cost certainty and risk mitigation. You will get that product delivered at a price, whereas with traditional construction, you know that it's a tender bid and that there's going to be some divergence from that original cost estimation.
So I suppose Edward's described from a sort of an investment sort of point of view, and from a development point of view. So in terms of the involvement that Homes England has in development, so we become involved in particular residential developments where there is market failure, and our intervention is required in order to unlock that site and bring it forward. So we do what we need to do in order to make that site come forward, or to make the market bring that site forward, but we don't do sort of more than we need to do. So in terms of our development model, we prepare sites for the market, and we get them into a place where the market will take them and build out homes. So we then as we market a site, we market that site through procurement processes. You know, we don't just sell sites freehold to developers. We market them through procurement processes to give us the ability to have some control over what's actually built on that site and the speed at which it's built. So in terms of the sites, you know, again, that we market, we do quite a lot of, you know, soft market testing in terms of understanding the restrictions on that site and what is possible on that site in that market. And we work through a building lease. So developers take, you know, a building lease as they enter into building lease with us as they develop out one of our sites. And within that lease, we place restrictions, you know, around, for example, design quality. There are certain standards that we require, or pace of build out, or, you know, use of MMC, just in order to sort of push that within the industry. So that's sort of the way that we work. You know, we work at sort of a relatively high level. We're not sort of involved in the day-to-day sort of construction of, you know, foundations or, you know, individual bits of buildings. We work very much through our building lease, in terms of encouraging the industry to deliver homes in the way that we want them to deliver those homes.
That's brilliant. I think, right, well, before we go into the other questions, because there's loads now and they're all really relevant and I'm just sort of threading them together in my head. There's kind of two sides to this. There's the unlocking the wider, and then we go back to the business models around, you know, if you're vertically integrated in plain English, as long as you're within the rules and regulations and doing the right thing, you can do what you like. So quick one, Tom, because time's running down. Do you experience these issues, or is it other issues that you face that are more pertinent? Like, obviously, what I mean is by that is linking that back to the procurement and contractual side. I suppose not at all.
Well, we do certainly. When we're buying land, is an interesting question. We deal with the banks, and you have to organise how you fund the issues that Ed was going through. So there are a number of issues. We get mortgages, and in this country, it's a very conservative country. People always want to do things the way they've done them last year. So anything innovation, anything new, always brings its own challenges. What I would say is we had the Queen's speech yesterday, though, didn't we? And a number of things in the Queen's speech and the government agenda, I think MMC really played to. The levelling up agenda in particular. And one of the big, house building is fantastic for creating jobs and training. The problem is most of the housing need is in wealthy areas with low unemployment, in the south, going to be very crude. And most of the jobs and training need is in areas of low housing need in the north, being very crude. And so actually building houses from the north and shipping them down the M1 and M6 to the south is an incredibly good way of trying to level up agenda. Likewise, we spoke about training, we spoke about sustainability, we spoke about embodied carbon. All of these items, I think the MMC can really play into the government's agenda.
Great, thanks, Tom. I've been given permission to, because there's so many questions, we're allowed to carry on for 5 more minutes, so I'm quite happy about that if everybody else is. But so I suppose to try and kind of bring this to a close and just sort of cover off some of the other questions, because it's really interesting. More around, if we go back to the pillars of beyond MMC, it's more, this is a design and perhaps digital as well related question. And I don't know if it's answerable in this, but I'll read it as it is. So do you think architects and other designers need to change how they produce information so it links more seamlessly with manufacturing? And if so, what software do you think will be key to unlock this? That's a big question. I don't know, Tara, do you want to have a first stab? Or I don't know.
I'll have a first stab and then I'll pass on to Matt, I think.
Yeah, fine.
I think, yes, architects need to change how we design. And looking at, the word was mentioned earlier, I think Ed was the one who mentioned it in terms of thinking about agnostic ways of how we design, specifically when it comes to DFMA, I guess. But also, and using more digitality, and by that focusing on generative design. At the moment, I think the tools, to be fair, I feel are quite limited to larger scale developments, which is not great because there are plenty of small scale developments that need to be done. So even using those, I think more efficiently is a start. But I think generative design is a really brilliant opportunity to bring to be developed and then used in smaller scale developments generally. But as a start, certainly with large scale developments, I think it needs to be a standard in our industry. And I'll pass on to Matt to expand on that, I'm sure.
That's fine. Matt, just
Yeah.
before you dive in, there's a bit of a bolt-on question from someone else that you might as well cover off at the same time, which is around, obviously, you know, when we all talk about MMC, if that's the word we're going to use for this, that, you know, you need that early engagement. So someone's asking, you know, can you give your perspective on what digital tools you're creating to inform the concept stage, REBA 2, REBA 3?
Yeah. No worries. I've seen that's from Nigel. Nigel and Sam.
Oh, yeah, of course you can see them as well. Yeah, good point.
Hawkins Brown. Yeah, we probably had this conversation about 2 years ago. But yeah, so right, I'll link it into Tara. So Tara's conversation allowed me to stall and think about what the answer would be, because it's a really complex one, and I'll link it to Nigel. So in summary, architects, consultants, whoever we're working with will then need to change the way they work inevitably, and that ecosystem needs to be enabled by people who are developers in the vertical world and main contractors as well. There are amazing tools coming forward, particularly around the generative design, but particularly around high fidelity modeling, digital twin. But all of that is only possible if you've got supply chain intelligent data in the back end. So if you're designing it high level at stage 2, the back end needs to be automatically connected into that stage 4 complex detail and design, and that's critical. And that will happen, but it's going to take time. So if everyone starts to focus on that future vision, that's great, but we need to start building the runway now to people for that kind of plane to eventually land on, is the common terminology that we're using where we are at the moment. And that means, look, we've got tools now. Right, and so we at Lendlease, we've fixed our world. We're lucky enough to have a really good partnership deal with a lot of different people in terms of software providers, and we have an ecosystem which now, to Nigel's question around what tools we have at stage 2 and 3. Well, where we are now is we use a specific operating system with Autodesk, and which allows live model data sharing to occur. Now, the reason that's so important is that allows us to then have, and it sounds really basic, issue management in a very easy, manageable format where people can look at it on their phones, on their iPad, and actually input. And the reason that's so important is that as consultants are designing, you need to make sure your trades or experts you have in your business can have an opinion, and have that opinion at that point. Don't wait for it 2 months down the line and then have an opinion, because that's useless. It'll just annoy our designers and make them charge us more money probably. But actually, it's about getting them involved and actually getting the intel. The reason I really wanted to be an architect, I just didn't have the commitment to finish up part 3. But that's because architects have got a great vision. That's why they're there. Doesn't mean that construction people have any less, but their vision, particularly I've seen from operational people, is real practicality and delivery. You've got to make sure they're working in the same ecosystems together, sharing those intel and advice. And that's exactly where we are. A guy left our business, 55 years, who's in our business, said to me, "You'll never replace my experience, Matt, with a digital tool." And I said, no, that's exactly why we need a digital tool, to get us at least halfway. Because without you, when are we going to have the next person who's been working 55 years in one place?
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So I mean, broadly, we've covered off the questions. I think probably if we lead with the final kind of terminology question, just for opinions, I don't whip round everybody and think, I'll park it as a question for people to think on. Is MMC the right terminology? Do we need a new word for this? Is it something like optimized construction? Is having MMC as a kind of dichotomy against traditional the right way to approach this? So I mean, our view is, I suppose, starting with that, and then I'll go around everybody, is that I think we need a common language in order to change something. And the irony is we've stuck with MMC, and that's what people are focusing on. But actually, in an ideal world, we change it. I think actually changing it is probably more difficult and adding more complications as necessary. So we'll go around as it is on my screen. Tom, what's your view on it?
So, I mean, we use precision engineering rather than MMC, but I'm so agnostic. Not the biggest thing I'm worried about. We talk about language. I'm far more worried about people using the term units rather than homes when we're building people's homes.
Yeah. Matt's next or at least on my screen.
Yeah, I'm not too fussed about the terminology of MMC. I think it's a myriad of things. We're in a period of huge innovation, so that language is constantly changing. My challenge would be, where's the conversation around construction 2025 when they set those 4 objectives? And where are the KPI outputs to see actually as an industry, where are we? That'd be fast. That'd be a more kind of evidence of how we generate and innovate in that space.
Yeah, brilliant. Edward?
So for me, it's about digitalization and industrialization. It's about closing the digital gap. We design buildings digitally, planning is going digital, and the moment we go analog and the construction site, that is about closing that gap in a factory using DFMA and digital tools. MMC is just a construction format about what you're doing in that factory.
Right. Deborah?
So I think for me, the term, modern methods of construction, the modern bit somehow makes me actually think about sort of the 1950s somehow, when we were all looking forward to like a modern world, and sort of Dan Dare comics and Festival of Britain and all these sort of things come to mind. I quite liked the term off-site manufacture. That was one I preferred a little bit. It's still not right. But yeah, I think we need something that's a little bit broader.
I agree. Tara? I don't know.
Just sticking with the broader point, I think perhaps there's an option to redefine MMC. So therefore, moving from the perception of systems to including more integratedly performance. We shouldn't have words like sustainable design. That should just be construction. That should just be the way we design, digitization, etc. So I guess it's really looking at redefining it until we come to a place where a society, it's just construction.
Great, thank you. So I suppose we've reached time. So just a very quick sort of roundup, if it is possible to round up that debate into one succinct thing. But I think where we've got to really is that I think we all agree that actually, we need to move to a broader focus that will bring us back to new ways of doing things. Layers and themes within that, we need to all look at the business models that we operate in. We all say about collaboration, we actually have to do it. It's work together, enable that through better contracts, etc. There's a definite requirement for strategy over project. So to look at the bigger picture, and also picking up on some of the things that Matt was saying particularly, but it's come up from everybody, is actually process over product. So how do we get to the point we need to be, not starting with the end in place? So that's my kind of summary. I'd like to thank everybody for joining the panel. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and again, we if we had more time, we could go on all day, I'm sure. But so thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Jamie. Excellent. No, it was a really superb debate this morning. And I know you could go on forever. And I think you did very well, Jamie, summarising those last questions. So, no, thank you very much to you all. Thank you to Jamie and now sort of Better Delivery, I shouldn't say BD Solutions today, for sponsoring today's event. And of course, to Max Farrell and the London Collective. No, I thought that was absolutely fascinating discussion. Whatever we call MMC in the future, is it postmodern or is it something different? I think you're all absolutely right in looking at early at the strategy, the benefits to the wider society, and clearly, in most instances, you're coming up with these so-called MMC models as a better way to deliver sustainability, energy and waste, looking at social outcomes, jobs, etc. But there's a need to go through that process early on of what you're trying to achieve, and then coming up with the construction and delivery solution. And that's become very evident. And I think it's really interesting, Tom's slides. And also it's interesting point on the levelling up agenda that this does have potential to, increase more volume of homes, but also in terms of sort of distribution across the UK. So absolutely fascinating. We'll send everybody, as we said, a copy of the Beyond MMC report that Jamie and his team's done. We'll keep you all updated. So thank you again to everybody. Looking forward to our next Movers and Shakers events. Next week on the 20th, we'll be having a mini lecture from Tony Travers. And then the following week, which is the 27th, 11 o'clock, we'll be looking at delivering major regeneration and lessons from the front line. And we've got some first-class speakers for that one. We'll make sure everybody gets all the information to log on and get involved. And as I said earlier, we'd love your feedback on the community platform. We're really developing our knowledge hubs and our sector information for everybody to keep updated. And as we're going back to physical in September, we really want to get everybody, their brands front of mind, get everybody involved on the community and engaged 24/7, ready to sort of go back to business. So do give us your feedback. Do remember your membership's going to last you through the year for when we go back to physical, so you can attend events across the UK, just booking online for the particular event. So really looking forward to that. And there is a lot to look forward to now. So thank you all for attending, joining us today, and have a great rest of your week from our family to yours. Thank you. Bye-bye.